Hello and good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this event this morning on health at older ages. It is clearly an inherently important issue that it matters for the living standards of people as they are ageing. But it's also important for governments who are thinking of the labour force participation of older workers, where health concerns, health issues are a constraint on employment at older ages. So today we've published new work unpacking the health of older workers, how that has changed over time and how it interacts with wealth. Before we kick off, I want to say a huge thanks to all of the members of the Retirement Savings Consortium at the IFS. I won't read you all out, but you are all here on the screen. We are both very grateful for the financial support provided through the Retirement Savings Consortium, without which this work would not be possible. But we also value the support that we get from our members in the form of useful comments from a range of public, private and third sector organisations that help make the work better. So a big thank you to all of you. That said, let me introduce our three speakers for today. You are first going to hear from Jonathan Cribb, who is Deputy Director here at the IFS, and he's going to give you an overview of recent trends and patterns in employment in later working life. You'll then hear from Bea Boileau, who's also a colleague here at the IFS, and she's going to present the main highlights from today's report. And then last but not least, you're going to hear a response from Alexandra Miles. Alexandra is chair of both the Pensions Gap and the Ageing Populations Working Parties of the Institute and Faculty for Actuaries, who are members of the Retirement Savings Consortium. We're very grateful to Alexandra for sharing her thoughts with us. So you'll hear from the three of them. I will then pop up and chair a Q&A. So you should have a Slido link. Please put your questions into Slido. Vote for the ones that you would most like to hear the answers to, and we will get through as many of those as we can. But for now, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helen. And my clicker works. It's fantastic. So I'll provide a bit of introduction here. I'm going to do a kind of overall, high-level introduction of some of the key statistics, as I said before. Bea jumps into the meat of our report. There's been considerable concern about trends in employment, particularly for those at older working age, and more generally in disability benefit receipt since the pandemic. With this context, it's important to know that the government has an extremely ambitious target of increasing the employment rate of working age individuals to 80% from its current level of 75%, and 80% will be up there with those countries with the very highest employment rates in the developed world. In the context of that target, older working age people are a particularly important group. They have considerably lower employment rates than younger adults, in part due to higher rates of ill health, and indeed as a result of more ill health, they're more likely to receive disability benefits. That being said, while that paints a somewhat negative picture, it's important to note that this group has seen significant rises in employment, including due to increases in the state pension age over the longer run. So what we're going to do is use new data, newly available data, to understand patterns of health for older working age individuals. We're going to really focus in on people aged 55 to 64 in particular, and relate them to economic inactivity and wealth, with me starting to focus on the trends in economic inactivity before passing over to Bea to talk more about health. So to provide context here, then it's worth reminding my audience here about how employment actually declines in people's 50s and 60s. So this chart is the employment rate by sex and single age of year in latest data, the yellow line for men and the green for women. And really what you can see here is that employment is broadly flat in people's early 50s. It's 85% for men and 78% at age 54. But it really starts declining more in people's late 50s and then into their early 60s. And by the time you get to age 64, it's down to 53% for men and 40% for women. And you get this further decline state pension age, again at 66. So it's really this kind of what we're going to focus in here in this report and this webinar is on that kind of middle group there between 55 and 64, when a lot of this decline in employment is happening. The other important context is where we are compared to other countries. So focusing in here then 55 to 64-year-olds, the average employment rate in 2022 for that age group in the UK was 64%. But you can see when I add in these other kind of comparator countries from the OECD, you can see that the UK is in the kind of we're not the lowest here, but in the kind of lower middle part of this particular ranking. And what's kind of really notable here is that while we have seen increases in employment rates at these ages over the last 10 or 15 years, as shown here, up from 57 to 64% over that 10-year period, shown that the growth there is actually not as high as many comparable countries. That's not only some of those kind of lower employment countries like Spain, France, and Italy beginning to catch up. But if you look, there are a set of other countries who in the early 2010s had more similar employment rates at these ages to us, including Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, who have kind of raced away from the UK and now have employment rates of over 70% for this age group. When thinking about employment at this age, it's really important to think about the types of people who are in and out of work and the constraints they face and the choices that they're making. And because of all that, that's why I'm going to now show you how employment rates differ for people in different parts of the wealth distribution, and that B is going to pick up on that further. So this is actually using data for England only, because that's where we have the best data on wealth at older ages. If I split the distribution into three groups, depending on the lowest third of the wealth distribution, the middle third, or the richest third, and look at those employment rates, then they differ. So they're highest for men in the middle third of the distribution and lowest for men in the poorest third, down at about 65% compared to almost 80% in the middle. And that pattern there is at a kind of that hump-shaped pattern by wealth, while at a lower level is there for women as well. Now, it won't surprise you that a considerable number of the richest third are not in paid work at these ages, because essentially they can afford to retire on the accumulated private pensions that they've built up over their life. And many of them self-report being retired. That's much less the case for the poorest third of the distribution, where people really are much more likely to report being economically inactive due to permanent sickness or disability. So this is the same thirds of the wealth distribution for men and women. Here shown that you're looking at a roughly 20% of the poorest third of people aged 55 to 64 who are reporting economic activity because of these health and disability concerns. So hopefully that provides a good background into some of these relationships between health, wealth, and employment. And I'll pass over to B to go into more detail, particularly on the health side.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. So I'll be talking in a bit more detail about the ways in which health has changed among those in their late 50s and early 60s over the last 2 decades, motivated by these kinds of associations between health and labour market activity that Jonathan set out. So I'll start off by telling you a bit more about the data that we use. So for this work, we use the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, or ELSA, a data set which covers people who are aged 50 or over and who live in England. We have more than 2 decades of data on this group of people, so covering the periods between 2002 to 3 and 2023 to 24. And we look specifically at those in their late 50s and early 60s, so those people kind of broadly in the run-up to state pension age. It also gives us rich detail on people's health, their wealth, and a set of demographics. And we're able to use this rich detail to really dig into how people's health has been changing over time. So in particular, what we do with the data on health that ELSA collects is we create a sort of health index, a composite measure of lots of different health problems that people might experience. This was originally designed to kind of capture work capacity, so really tells us something in particular about the sort of health that might be associated with employment rates and with labour market activity. We collect information on whether people experience 12 specific problems, summing these together to create our index, including lots of different areas of health, so mobility, vision, incontinence, and mental health, among others. And I'll go into a bit more detail as to each of these 12 health problems here. And we'll look at the share of people in their late 50s and early 60s who experience each of these health problems in the latest wave of data, so in 2023 to 24. Here I'm showing you what those levels look like among women in their late 50s and early 60s. You can see that there's quite a lot of variation in the share who experience these different health problems, so ranging from around 5% who have difficulty with picking up a 5p coin from a table to 25% for having experienced incontinence over the last year. Bringing men up now, we can see that there's a picture of quite a lot of difference here. So men's health tends to be better on average. For all of these problems apart from one, men are less likely to be experiencing these problems than women in the latest wave of data. But there's also quite a different pattern. So men are most likely to experience poor hearing, for example, the one problem where they're more likely to be experiencing this than women of the same age. We can broadly use this set of 12 problems to classify 55 to 64-year-olds into 4 broad groups. First, there's those who essentially experience none of these health problems, then mild and moderate groups who experience medium levels of these health problems, and then our severe group who experience 6 or more of these health problems over time, out of 12. And I'll first of all show you what these groups have looked like over time among men. So first of all, I'm bringing up the share of 55 to 64-year-old men who've experienced severe levels of health problems over the 2 decades covered by ELSA. As a reminder, this is those who've experienced 6 or more out of 12 health problems. We can see that this has broadly been declining over time, so falling from 7% in 2002 to 3 to 3% in the latest wave of data. There's been a roughly constant share of those who experience moderate levels of health problems and a slightly falling share of those experiencing mild health problems. So you'll see a kind of rise that leaves over in those who experience essentially no health problems over time. So a picture of kind of improving health using this index for men over time. You'll see that the bulk of this improvement in health is really taking place kind of over the 2000s and into the mid-2010s, with perhaps slightly more stability since that point in men's health. We can think now about what this picture looks like among women. So as with men, I'm first bringing up the picture of those who experience severe levels of health problems over time. And you'll see that in contrast to what we saw for men, there's been a rise in the share who experience 6 or more health problems out of 12 over time. We do see a slightly offsetting fall in the share who experience moderate health problems and another fall in the share experiencing mild health problems. So quite a complicated picture for women then. A slightly increasing share of women who experience essentially no health problems over time, perhaps particularly over the 2000s. But then within the group who experience some health problems, a concentration of the number of health problems that are being experienced. And I want to really come back to that share of men and women who experience 6 or more health problems out of 12. So you'll see that in 2002 to 3, this was a pretty similar share, so it's about 7%. But since that point over time, we've seen a gradual increase for women and a gradual decline for men. So now a picture that looks very different when we look at the latest wave of data for the prevalence of experiencing this high level of health problems using our health index. So this is really thinking about kind of overall health and using our health index to measure that. But I want to really go on to talk about some specific health problems that are being experienced in some more detail. And here I'll think specifically about mobility issues and about mental health issues. And that's really because we know that musculoskeletal issues and psychological issues are the main reasons for people receiving disability benefits, so are likely to be really importantly linked to labour market activity for this group. I'll start off by thinking about the share of people in their late 50s and early 60s who experience at least one mobility problem and how that's changed over time. And I'll be splitting by sex throughout this analysis. Here I'm showing you the share of men who experience at least one mobility problem. And we can see a picture of improving mobility among this group of men. So in particular, over the 2000s and until the mid-2010s, we've seen a steady decline in the share who experience at least one mobility problem. Slightly more stability since that point, but in general, quite a kind of marked fall in the share who experience these problems. For women, we also see improving mobility over time. So in particular, over the 2000s, we see a falling share of women of this age who experience at least one of these mobility problems before being kind of stability over the 2010s and in more recent data. Something to take from this graph as well is that mobility problems are more common among women, and this gap is kind of widening given that women have seen a slightly smaller share fall in the share experiencing mobility problems. So a picture of kind of improving mobility for both men and women on average. Thinking now about mental health problems, I'll focus in on a measure of whether people are experiencing depressive symptoms and look at how that's changed over time. Among men, we see that the share experiencing some depressive symptoms has stayed pretty stable over time. So over the 2 decades that we consider, it's hovered around 10 to 13% of men of this age. And you'll note that this is really quite a lot lower than the prevalence of mobility problems. For women, the share experiencing depressive symptoms is higher than in men every year that we consider. But you'll also see that there seem to have been somewhat different trends since the mid-2010s. So we have seen a rise in the share of women who experience these depressive problems from around 15% in the mid-2010s, rising to more like 21% in the latest data. So some quite different trends among men and women then, with stability among men and a kind of worsening among women, or at least a rise in the share who experience these symptoms. We can think now about the sort of differences that we see in these trends, not only by sex, but thinking about wealth. So wealth is a kind of good measure of broad socioeconomic status and can help capture kind of differences across the wealth distribution that tell us something about inequalities by socioeconomic status. As Jonathan showed, we know that wealth is also strongly linked to and predictive of economic activity, and economic activity for health-related reasons in particular. So what I'll do here is I'll use the data that ALSA collects on people's wealth and split both men and women into thirds by wealth. And we can think about how these trends in mobility and mental health problems look across the wealth distribution for both men and women. Here I'm showing you the share of the poorest third of 55 to 64-year-old men who experience mobility problems over time. And you can see that this share is quite high, but that we've seen the same sorts of falls that we saw when looking at the overall picture for men. The same is true when we look at the middle third by wealth and at the richest third by wealth of men. So while there are really strong kind of socioeconomic differences in the share who experience these mobility problems, and that's been the case over time, we do see a decline in the share who experience these mobility problems really across the wealth distribution for men. For women, the picture does look slightly different. So I'm going to show a very similar picture here of the share of 55 to 64-year-old women in each wealth third who experience mobility problems. You can see that among the least wealthy third of women, the share who experience mobility problems has been quite similar over time. So a real stability around 53 to 58% of this group of women. Among the middle third of women by wealth, you can see that there has been a decline, and the same has been true for the richest third of women. So really strong differences between each wealth third in the prevalence of mobility problems. These are far more common among the poorest third of women than among the richest third of women. And also a real widening of these disparities by wealth. So you'll see that because we've seen this sustained level of mobility problems for the poorest third of women, but we've seen declines for the richest third, these gaps in health by wealth have really opened up among women in a way that we haven't seen for men. I'll move on now to think about the mental health issues that I talked about earlier, so this measure of depressive symptoms, and again, splitting people into wealth thirds. Here I'm showing you the share of the poorest third of men who experience some level of depressive symptoms. You can see that this has been somewhat stable over time. The same is true when thinking about the middle third by wealth and about the richest third by wealth. So again, as we saw with mobility, these strong socioeconomic disparities, but not a picture of widening over time. Instead, we've seen stability for men in the share who experience depressive symptoms across the wealth distribution. And as for mobility, this is not the picture that we saw for women. So here I'm showing you the share of the poorest third of women who experience some depressive symptoms. We can see that this has risen quite considerably over time. So from the mid 2010s to the latest wave of data, this has risen from around 25% to more like 39%. Among the middle third of women, on the other hand, the share who experience depressive symptoms has looked pretty similar over time. And we've seen a rise for the richest third, but this is less large in absolute terms. So this much larger absolute rise among the poorest third of women has meant that these absolute gaps in the share who experience depressive symptoms have widened over time. And given this kind of concerning rise in depressive symptoms among the poorest third of women in particular, we can think about how the share of women who experience depressive symptoms varies by whether women are in work or not. So kind of coming back to our initial question and to Jonathan's presentation, thinking about the links between health and economic activity. It's quite hard to interpret the kind of changes in the share experiencing depressive symptoms among women who are in or out of work over time, because of kind of big compositional differences in who's in work or out of work over time. We know for women in particular, the state pension age has risen quite considerably over this period. So there have been real changes in the types of people who tend to be in or out of work. But here I'm showing you the share of women not in paid work who experience depressive symptoms. And I want to really focus on this level of around 31%, or 3 in 10 women in the latest wave of data. When we look at the share of women experiencing depressive symptoms who are in work, you can see that this is much lower across the period, so more like 15% in the latest wave of data. So indicative that there are really important associations here between kind of economic activity and these sorts of health problems that we talk about. So I'll now move on to just kind of wrapping up what both me and Jonathan have told you today. We've seen from Jonathan's presentation that health is a really important predictor of labour market activity among this group of people who are in the run-up to state pension age, so in their late 50s and in their early 60s. I've shown some strong differences in how health has evolved by sex. So we've seen a picture of kind of improvement among men, and we've seen a more complicated picture for women, with worsening among some specific health problems, such as experiencing lots of conditions at once or depressive symptoms. We've also seen strong differences by wealth in all the health problems that we consider. And among women, we've seen widening gaps in health by wealth over time. And we've seen this picture of mental health worsening, particularly among the least wealthy women. And this will be one important challenge for policymakers who are seeking to increase employment. So as Jonathan began by setting out, despite the increases in employment we have seen over the last decade or so, other countries both have higher employment rates at these ages and have seen bigger rises more recently. So any ambition to kind of get close to an 80% employment rate needs to really take these sorts of work patterns and these challenges with health very seriously. I'll then wrap up and hand over to Alexandra to respond.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to respond. So the question of ill health, employment and pension saving is critical, not just for individuals, but for society and the economy as a whole. And I've been working with actuarial colleagues across the industry exploring these areas further through 2 working parties I chair, Pensions Gap and Ageing Populations, that's just recently launched. People are living longer, but not always healthier lives. Longevity has soared, yet health gaps remain stark. Ken Dirkwald, a leading gerontologist and futurist known for his influential work on how population ageing is transforming society, the economy and the future of work, health and retirement, delivered a keynote recently at a US Aging conference, highlighting how looking at ages and stages has shifted. He mentions that for 99% of human history, average life expectancy has been less than 18 years, and that 2/3 of all those that have lived past 65 are alive today. The old age of the 1930s is better termed late adulthood in the 2000s. As we've seen in the IFS report, employment amongst 55 to 64-year-olds has risen over the past 20 years. for men from 60 to 70%, and for women from 47 to 66%. But working longer depends on health, and here the inequalities are huge. In the UK, healthy life expectancy differs by 19 years between the richest and the poorest. Ill health often forces early retirement, stalling pension saving and increasing reliance on the state. State pension is currently about £12,000 a year versus a minimum income standard of £14,200 for someone who owns their own home. This leaves a gap that needs to be filled by private pensions wealth. IFYA research by the Pensions Gap Working Party shows life events, career breaks, part-time work and divorce can cut savings by tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds. And women are hit hardest. Moving to part-time for half of your career can mean £200,000 less at retirement. A 6-month break, roughly £30,000 less. Women would need to work 19 years longer to reach pensions parity with men. Auto-enrolment helps, but current minimums won't deliver adequacy for many. The great risk transfer that the IFA has done lots of work on shifts responsibilities from employers and state to individuals for private sector workers, many lacking the necessary financial literacy and capability to take this on. McKinsey, in a report out earlier this year, warns that banked economic growth gains from older and female workforce participation are near their limits. Future growth depends on productivity and policies enabling longer, healthier working lives. While ONS data shows pensions wealth is highly unequal in the UK. The top 10% hold 64% of overall pensions wealth. The bottom 50% hold just 1%. With dependency ratios estimated to fall from 4-to-1 to 2-to-1 over the coming decades, how will a shrinking workforce fund a growing retired population? The report shows that health has stabilised for men, but has got worse for women. For the lower wealth cohorts, over half of women have mobility issues, and this has not seen the same improvements as has been seen for men. Mental health is similarly bad at 40% and has increased noticeably recently for women, with a big difference between those in work and those not. A recent study published in the Nature Journal shows gender strongly interacts with income. Women in lower income groups display the highest and most multifaceted risk of depressive symptoms, driven by poorer self-rated health, financial strain, weaker digital inclusion, and a higher likelihood of living alone or lacking partner support. Perimenopause and menopausal transition is also a measurable biological risk for depression in this age group. A recent Harvard Business Review article focused on the US, but still highly relevant here, highlights the caregiver support ratio. That's the ratio of age 45 to 64-year-olds to 80-plus-year-olds, was 7-to-1 in 2010. By 2030, this will have fallen to 4-to-1 and is estimated to fall a further to 3-to-1 by 2050. Care is expensive, but who fills the gap? At the moment, mostly women, often mid-career, increasingly sandwiched between raising kids and caring for parents. Many reduce their hours, and 1 in 6 retire early because care becomes a second full-time job. The result is a huge loss in productivity, emotional burnout, and mental health decline. So what needs to happen? A sustainable response to ageing populations depends on keeping more people healthy enough to work longer. That means tackling health inequalities, supporting women, and improving pensions adequacy. The IFA Ageing Populations Working Party, which I chair, is exploring practical solutions to ensure longer lives don't mean greater inequality. Our first article is now out in the November-December Actuary magazine, with far more to follow. The challenge is clear. Longer lives must be healthier lives, or the maths of pensions, care, and economic sustainability simply won't add up. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you for everybody else. Great, it's time for your questions. So people are saying lots of questions into Slido, so thank you very much. Do keep adding those and voting for the ones you want to hear the answers to most. I'm going to take the first question actually in a group of the other questions. So a whole bunch of people are asking things to the effect of what are the other things happening at older ages? So let me give you a sense of that, then I'll throw it to our panelists. So questions like, how much do you know that it's really health that means many people are leaving the labour force? There's any causal evidence on that. Surely job satisfaction and employer engagement and support, such as retraining, are reasons why people want to quit early. Is that another reason for falling rates? And the top question is about basically one of the points that Alexandra picked up on. Women, especially in the 55 to 64 age group, are likely to be in caring for others, including parents and grandchildren. Are the countries that are doing better than us, do they have better caring support? So a broad question there really about what are the other things that are happening alongside health issues that are affecting labour force participation? Jonathan, I'll come to you first.
Yeah. So one of them was about kind of how much we know is really health that's meaning people are leaving the labour market. Is it just kind of two lines going in we know health going down and employment going down and saying that they're happening together? Well, some of our colleagues here at IFS have done much more careful detailed work on precisely these trajectories and how much they can explain retirement behavior between the ages of, I think they did 50 to 70, but broadly these ages. It's not the only thing. Health is not the only thing. It explains a kind of significant minority of retirement behavior. It explains more retirement behavior for low educated people than for higher educated people. That's not unsurprising. And it explains a bit less actually of retirement behavior in England than it does in the United States. They have more stark health inequalities in the United States actually than in England, for example. And then when I've still got the microphone, maybe on the caring point, it's a really important point. Older people at this kind of older working age part of their life are often juggling lots of different responsibilities, potentially people below, family members, both younger and older. But that being said, over time, the fraction of people who report that they're not out of work because of those kind of caring responsibilities is falling. It's essentially always been very small for men. It used to be really significant for women of between about 12% of all women in their late 50s used to say they were not working because they were looking after family. That's down closer to 6% now. So it's not unimportant, but the direction of travel here is kind of over the longer run downwards, whereas the direction of travel for some of these health-related things is more worrying.
Right. Alexandra, do you want to add anything about this broad question of the other things that are happening in people's lives that are affecting participation in the workforce?
I just think to build on what Jonathan said, at that age group, there's a lot going on for people. And with people having children later, that kind of sandwich generation of people looking after still younger children and then having to pick up the care or wanting to pick up the care for elderly parents, plus needing to have a job because lots of households are in a situation where you need two incomes. It doesn't surprise me that there has been a knock-on impact on health and women, especially for the depressive symptoms.
Great, thank you. On to the next question at the top of our list in two parts. So the first says, and I'll come to you on this, B. The charts are no surprise, given that the lowest paying jobs are the most likely to be bad for people's health. Actually, there are a whole range of other questions that are basically about asking what's going on. Is it something about people's jobs, they're more manual, they're more stressful? Is it the jobs themselves earlier in life that are causing poor health? Do we know much about that?
Yeah, we didn't get super into kind of exactly what jobs people were doing in the report. I think we would expect that kind of different jobs would have different effects on people's health, and that those in hard jobs would see kind of bigger health impacts from that. I think that it's true that we also know that being in or out of work can itself kind of affect people's health. So these kinds of we chart kind of associations here. We think about how health might be affecting employment, but we also can think about how employment itself is likely to be changing health.
Great. And the other part, sorry, Jonathan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of maybe a bit about hard jobs, and I think I think there's worth thinking about what time period we're thinking about changes over. We focused on changes over the last 20 years, in particular, some of these more negative trends over the last 10-ish years, or spiking up kind of post-pandemic. It does matter if you think back over a longer period of time, back to the 70s, when most, particularly men, used to work, quite late into their 60s. Most would retire at 65. They also tended to do much more physically demanding work in the 70s. That's kind of why, if you take a long run perspective, it looks like there's quite a lot of health capacity to work, because of the kind of very high male employment rates back in the 70s and the difficulty of work, compared to where we are now. I think that what might have changed in some sense is some people's expectations here, and to some extent that there are kind of wealthy people, because we're so much richer than the 70s, there is a set of people that are kind of so much wealthier now that they don't need to, even if they've got that health capacity, they don't need to. Whereas on the poorer side, I think it's maybe some more different types of health conditions, including the mental health conditions, compared to what it was, back when manual work, and if you're back when that was kind of it.
Great, thank you. So the other part of the question, I'll come to you in this first, Alexandra, is there a way to incentivize employers to look after people long term, including those in hard jobs? And there's other questions of a similar nature. So what is the role of occupational health in mitigating the effect of working longer? Are there adaptations that employers can make? So any views on the roles that employers can play in all of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about aging populations, and maybe there will be more pressure or a need for people to work longer, and therefore for employers to incentivize staff to keep them in the workforce longer. And kind of the idea of retirement, and harking back to Ken Dirkwald, he said in the US it was a way of getting older people out of the workforce because of rising unemployment at younger ages. So to kind of clear the way for younger to get into the workforce, whereas now with aging populations, we've got the reverse of that. We need people to be working longer in order to have the productivity, economic growth that we need in the future. So I think, that's an interesting area. And I think, we'll need to do more work in that area going forward.
Great. Anything to add on that, guys?
I think that there's something to be said for thinking about the types, when we talk about employers, I think it does very much matter the size of these employers, actually. In general, the kind of, the situation in which occupational health sits, it sits alongside other employee benefits, that it can be easier for larger or public sector employers to provide. But there is a very large number of people who are working for smaller firms, who don't often provide as many different benefits alongside them. And I think I always think we need to be a bit careful with thinking about the role of employers about this kind of firm size distribution. How much are we thinking about responsibilities of big employers versus smaller employers? And how much is it about encouraging people don't move job very much at these ages. How much is it about it's important for people, a little bit more flexibility here, for people to be finding the right match at these ages, particularly when you have quite a long time horizon now, rather than necessarily, being or feeling stuck in the same old job you've been doing for a long time.
Yeah, and of course, at the extreme of that distribution of firm sizes, there are self-employed people who have no employer, and therefore they're their own employer.
And it's very important at these ages. Yeah. And maybe that's fine. And for some people, that's going to be fine, but they don't have that support alongside, colleagues and other people who can help them in that way.
Absolutely. Lovely. So there are a set of questions here, basically about why women have poorer health. So I'll read one of them, but I think there's a broader set of questions about what's going on for women. So one example question: could the increase in depressive symptoms be linked to the rise in acceptance, acknowledge, and understanding of women's health over 50, and the demand for hormone replacement therapies, for example? So part of this question about what's going on, part of this question about is health actually worsening, or are we just better at recording and understanding women's health? Maybe I'll come to you first, Alexandra. I mean, what do you think we know or need to know about women in particular as they're in this period? I know you mentioned menopause as an example of things that happen in people's lives.
Yeah, I guess that's, it's not a new phenomenon, but maybe more well understood, as you've said, and the kind of public awareness of it and employer policies to support people, women going through that phase of their life is really important, especially when we're thinking about enabling people to work for longer. Self-reported data, I'm not sure why more would be self-reporting that. I think cost of living, perhaps. We haven't mentioned the cost of living and the economic pressures that many are under at the moment, and that feeding into general health, and ability to be in good health, the stress and strain of keeping the show on the road, especially when you've got caring responsibilities and you've got a day job as well. That pressure can be huge. So that could be a part of the self-reporting of a pickup in these symptoms.
And I assume, looking at my colleagues here, I assume it's hard from the data to know exactly why women are having more health issues in the data.
It is. I mean, some of them. We wanted to highlight the mental. Look, I don't think we know everything that's going on. You know, I listened to the IFS podcast series about the kids being okay. A lot of the focus is on children's mental health. Not everything is understood there. One of the reasons we wanted to highlight this is because I think that people don't think about these age groups with regard to mental health, even though, you know, NHS data shows that, you know, antidepressant prescriptions, for example, are very high. You know, they rise by age. You know, you're more likely to be prescribed antidepressants in your 60s than you are in your 30s, for example. But it is somewhat still a bit of a black box. One thing that a lot of people say is that it's for women at these ages, is it to do with increasing the state pension age? And in a sense, there's lots of reasons you might think that the case. Increasing the state pension age reduces people's incomes, nudges quite strongly a set of people to work longer. You got higher poverty rates, for example. But unfortunately, unfortunately, that's probably the wrong word. The evidence is still quite mixed on whether that particular policy change is driving poorer mental health. Unfortunately, there are papers that show that it is driving worse mental health, and there are papers that show that it isn't, and so we still don't, again, fully understand that.
And of course, it could have different effects for different women, depending on whether they stay in the labour force or they drop out of the labour force, whether they can afford to be out of the labour force. But actually, that might partly reflect that actually it's not a common effect for all women, depending on their circumstances.
No, and I think B can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the rises in poor mental health are larger for single women, but there's not that many single women in our data. But is that right?
Sure, yeah, but no, that is right.
Great, thank you. So B, there's a couple of questions here that we can take easily on how you measure wealth, and in particular, one particular question is, does it include owner-occupied homes, and if so, is that going to be directly linked to regional inequalities because people have different wealth depending on where they live in the country?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The main aspect of wealth that we're really capturing is probably going to be housing wealth for most of this group, because this is kind of total non-pension wealth that we're really using. So housing will be kind of the biggest element of that, along with then kind of financial and physical wealth as well.
But that's going to be a measure of wealth that's all wealth minus your pension, minus any debts you've got. So it's going to be your home plus any savings you've got.
Exactly right. So I think it is probably true that kind of there's a regional aspect to this, and that probably if we'd looked by region, we might have seen some interesting regional inequalities. It's definitely kind of one of many aspects of things that could be widening inequalities here.
Yeah, although, I mean, my understanding here is that a lot of the issues are kind of some of the very poorest, least healthy areas within region. And of course, the big region that does look poor in general, worse here in general, is Scotland. And we don't have, our data, unfortunately, because of how surveys were set up 25 years ago, really focuses on England.
Great. Okay, so the question that's now at the top is, would be interesting to know how many people are out of work, paid work by choice, because they can fund early retirement, or those who want to work but experience age discrimination. So really a question there about, I mean, some people might not be in work because they just can't, they're not healthy enough to work. Some people might just be out of work because they can afford to. And if you can afford to and you're in ill health, you might be more likely to be out of work. And then there might be issues around age discrimination.
Right. I don't know. Do you want to?
I mean, I was going to say, I think that in some ways, as an initial answer to this, the two graphs that you showed with the employment rate of this group and then the percentage who are inactive due to permanent sickness really helped to get at this. So we know that the employment rate of those in their late 50s and early 60s is highest among those in the middle of the wealth distribution. And we know that those who are kind of richer are more likely to report being retired. Those who are poorer are more likely to report being out of work due to permanent sickness. That helps give us some sense of kind of who's making these choices out of choice, who's maybe leaving because of permanent sickness, which is much less a matter of choice.
Yeah. It's so they're not in the report, but they're in a previous report of mine from a couple of years ago. About 25% of the richest 20%, which is percentages of percentages is a bit hard to get your head around. About a quarter of the richest fifth.
The top few percent.
The top few percent, you know, they are saying that they are retired, you know, they're self-reported retired in, you know, in their late 50s and early 60s. Maybe some of them might have felt forced out. Maybe some of them might have felt discriminated against. But, you know, it in general looks like choices you're less worried about. I think that age discrimination is something to worry about. You know, people have started doing kind of random CV studies on this kind of thing in the same way as you change kind of people's kind of gender on a CV or ethnicity or work background, and you see and you get less callbacks. We know that if you are made unemployed in your late 50s or early 60s, the probability of you getting back to work is quite low. That's not you know, prima facie evidence of discrimination there, but it does point to difficulties here, that when shocks come along for this set of older people, older working age people, that they're kind of harder to adjust to.
Right. So there's a bunch of questions here spattered around, that are jumping around about the role of the private versus the public sector. And I think the questions boil down to what extent do patterns for women look different because of the sectors that they work in, and in particular women are more likely to, I think this is true, Jonathan, to work in the public sector. So basically what do we know about the public versus private sector and how that's interacting with people and their working lives at older ages? That's one of you.
Yeah. So women are more likely to work in the public sector, although the public sector is not that big compared to the private sector. So it's still the majority of working women are still in private sector jobs, not public sector. We know that people are much more likely to retire, leave the labour force earlier, particularly at age 60. If you're in the public sector, there are sets of pension incentives which really focus retirement at that age. For private sector workers, you know, there used to be very strong incentives to retire at, say, 65, when a kind of standard old-fashioned, what people now call gold-plated, but I would call defined benefit pension scheme, would kind of incentivize you to retire. With the decline of that, what you're seeing is more heterogeneous behavior of some people retiring, you know, relatively early in the private sector. Some people, you know, really working, you know, quite long into people's 60s or even into their 70s, particularly if they make a transition to self-employment. So I think the big thing here is actually there's still a set of incentives that disproportionately affect women to leave right basically at your 60th birthday in the public sector.
Great, thank you. There's another question here about unpaid care and how we think about it. I'll come to you on this first, Alexandra. So the question is, why are women doing unpaid care considered not productive versus if it was paid? There are benefits to being cared for by a loved one. Reframing how we measure productivity and other metrics could help. So I think partly there's two parts to that, isn't there? There's one about how we value this kind of work, and everyone agrees that it's valuable. But there's also an issue about people being sort of financially prepared for retirement and that being linked to how much they've earned.
Yeah, and that's a really good question and point. Yeah, I think the point about how we value the different roles we play in society. I recently read an amazing book, Head, Heart, Hand, which looks at those kind of 3 types of jobs. And over recent time, like the last 50 years, we've really valued head over heart and hand. But there's a question about, with aging populations, whether those 2 others, hand and heart, really come more to the fore. And we are kind of needing to value those more, given the number of people that will need to care for others. And actually in the States, there's more people looking after old people than young now. That tip happened last year. So I think there's a fundamental question about how we value those roles. And social care in the UK, we know is a sector that has the most number of vacancies. There's huge turnover in that sector. Known issues with support for people who work in that sector, how it's valued. And ideally you would look after your loved ones, but if it's necessary for you to have a job as well, it makes sense that more women, because women predominantly do perform more of the caring or pick up more of the caring roles, will need to fit that in among their paid roles work.
Can I add a note of positivity, although, on this?
No,
because
it's good.
I'm not saying that there are not continued issues regarding these inequalities, particularly with regard to private wealth accumulation. But it was only 16 years ago, back in 2009, that women who reached state pension age specifically before April 2010, had dramatically lower state pensions as a result of periods out of the labour force looking after children. Reforms in 2010 and then the new state pension have meant we've got a much more solid state pension system, which provides a better foundation, including for disproportionately women who spend more time out of the labour market, particularly looking after children. It's not to dismiss the challenges that still exist, but to the extent that people are worried about this, there has been real progress on the state pension side, at least for kind of, younger pensioners and those approaching pension age.
Yeah, and that is important. I was about to say, in some ways there's a tension here, because even if caring roles have parity of esteem in the sense that we all know they're valuable, you still need to be saving some financial resources for retirement, but the state pension gives you that floor, and that is now equal across the sexes. Couple of factual questions here. I'll come to you on B. In alphabetical order. So does the decrease for men or the increase for women in poor health by sex over time lag the change in employment rates? So are we seeing changing in health and then changing in employment? And is that evidence of a causal link?
I think that looking at the 2 series is probably not going to give us the causal evidence that we really want, kind of no matter which order they're happening in. And really, I mean, we've seen rises in employment rates over the period that we're talking about for both men and women. So we don't see a kind of decline for women that we could then attribute to declining health. I think, as I think Jonathan said, health is a really important part of this. And we do know from other evidence that health has these important causal links to some extent, but health isn't going to be the full picture of explaining why we've seen kind of quite large changes in employment, increases in employment for both men and women kind of over this period. But no, I think from other work, although not from this report, we do know that kind of changes in health are importantly and often causally linked to changes in employment on a kind of more micro level.
And it's really complicated because the other thing happens too, is that work affects health.
Right,
we know that the increase in the and affects different types of health in different ways. We know that the increase in employment for women in their early 60s that came as a result of the state pension age improved their cognitive function, and it improved their physical disability, how quickly they walk, these kind of physical problems that people have at these ages, but not for everyone. If you're working more sitting in an office staring at a screen, it's actually not that good for your physical health. But if you're getting up and around and you're commuting and you're walking to work, these are kind of good things. So it's really complicated just because of these multiple different directions of causality, and because of the different ways in which because of the different facets of work and the different facets of health.
Great, thank you. Another factor. Oh, sorry, Alexandra.
Sorry, I was just going to come in there. Something we haven't mentioned is social connection, and how for many that is a key benefit of working. So perhaps if people are working longer, they're keeping those social connections stronger for longer, and that's particularly important for men who maybe are less socially connected outside work. We see that in the data that I've looked at. So that might be improving health, particularly for men, as men stay in the workforce for longer.
And particularly important for singles too, who don't have that relationship at home in the same way.
Great, thank you. Another couple of factual questions that we'll just whip through, B. So one is, how are depressive symptoms defined? Men also have higher suicide rates. Does the metric of depressive symptoms have an impact on daily functioning? I think the basic answer is they're all self-reported, but you come on that. And I'll also let you answer, basically, how is COVID affecting things here? Is the latest data distorted by the spillover effects from COVID?
Yeah, two good questions. We define depressive symptoms essentially as experiencing 4 or more out of 8 potential ways of feeling depressed, or kind of having sleep issues or other things like that kind of over the last week. So it's a kind of composite of a lot of different things that you could be experiencing.
This is a survey where the survey asks people to self-report.
Yeah.
It's not like a medical data.
No,
It's asking you to report, have you experienced some of these things?
But it's not just like, are you depressed? It's more complex than just, are you depressed?
That's true. But all of these health things that we're using in this report, at least, are kind of relying on people's self-reports. So that's how we define depression. What was the other factual question again?
COVID. So how much is the data being affected by any fallout from COVID?
Yeah, so I mean, when we kind of started this report, the aim was to kind of integrate this with some labour force survey data. As we know, that data has kind of suffered really quite significantly around the time of the pandemic, and we in the end chose to really focus in on ELSA. I think we see kind of the types of rises in disability benefit claims, for example, that we know took place, and it looks like there's been less of a dramatic decline in kind of response rates to ELSA. So I think we can be kind of more confident that the trends that we're seeing are real in some sense, rather than an artifact of the pandemic. Another key reason why we look over this longer sweep of time too, so over this 2-decade periods, is to really focus in on the kind of long-term trends that we're seeing. So we're not kind of overanalyzing a single wave of data where low response rates might be an issue. But no, I think we can be relatively confident in this.
Brilliant. And for all the other questions that are about specific data points, look at the report, because there's loads of brilliant charts in there. I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask everyone the same final question. I'll come to you first, Alexandra, which is, what else do we need to know in this area? So obviously there's loads of great work in this report. There's loads of other great work that everyone here has done in the past. This issue about older people getting into and staying into and being healthy in the workplace isn't going away anytime soon. So thinking about how we design policy in this area, what's the other thing we wish we knew? Alexandra?
I guess because all of the data, as you caveated, is self-reported, it'd be fantastic to have access to some kind of more comprehensive and not self-reported data, and be able to track that through time. And I guess then the link of pensions, wealth accrual to health and employment, I think connecting those is really important to study moving forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll pick up on Alexandra's second point, which is about pensions, because automatic enrollment and the rise of defined contribution pensions mean that more and more people are approaching the kind of ages where these kind of age-related health concerns are picking up, with this pot of potentially flexible pension wealth. And currently you can withdraw that in any way you want from 55. That's going to go to 57 in a couple of years' time. It's still relatively early compared to pension age. and quite how people are using these pension freedoms and defined contribution pots when they're so broad across society now, at least at low levels, how that interacts with a little bit of work income or their disability benefits or their means tested benefits. There are different parts of the state interacting here that I don't think we've thought enough about, either as analysts or in government.
Great. B.
I think really digging into this question about kind of good jobs and bad jobs and kind of which types of jobs are kind of affecting the health of this group of people and kind of where jobs are having kind of good or bad effects, why that is. I think that would be really important and help add to these trends.
Brilliant. So lots to keep us busy. But on that, let me say thank you to all three of our wonderful speakers, and thank you to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed that, we have another webinar also drawing on this programme of work funded by the Retirement Savings Consortium on December the 2nd. It's fascinating stuff. I've seen the pre-brief on risks of cognitive decline at older ages and how people use their financial wealth at older ages. So we hope to see you again for that. But for now, thank you very much, everyone.